good morning, or whatever time you're listening to our podcast here on the Red Recover Inside the Paint Show. I'm Ira Winderman. He's Kurt Helin out 6 a.m. in California because he loves basketball that much. Kurt, I want to start here where I think most Heat fans want to start. Certainly feel free to jump on our chat board and we'll go from there on our YouTube chat board. But we finally put the Kevin Durant thing to rest, and I think you and I can both agree that's going to stay quiet for a little bit now. Kevin, for a little bit, stay quiet now. But this Donovan Mitchell thing, I'm so glad we're on today. I'm so glad we're going to have a full hour to go through this because I'm still not sure what the RJ Barrett thing did, what the Knicks artificial deadline did, where Donovan Mitchell is going. So with all the details from Basketball Talk, Kurt Helin out in California, Kurt, do we have more of a sense of where Donovan Mitchell is headed, if the Heat still have a chance? Or is it sort of just a convoluted Monday and Tuesday with the RJ Barrett talk and the New York Knicks talk?
It's funny. I don't know how much you've dealt with this on your end, Ira. Like, how much RJ Barrett mattered to that deal really depended on who you asked, right? Like, there were people who said, no, they really wanted RJ Barrett. He's the best Knicks player. He was a key part of it. But I'll tell you, the people I trust more, and I'm not the only person who have said this.
Sure.
Mark Berman has been all over at the New York Post, and there's others. Danny Ainge wants draft picks. You know, it'd be nice to get RJ Barrett, but if he ends up with Obi Toppin and somebody else, then that's fine too. You know, maybe Quentin Grimes, maybe not. Maybe it's somebody else off the roster. The players are, I'm not going to say incidental, but not the key part of this to them. It's about picks. That's why the Lakers are suddenly mentioning it. Like, it's about how many picks can he get. And so on that front, it doesn't really change. And I don't think it really, I mean, Ira, does it really change for the Heat? The Heat's offer remains the Heat's offer. It didn't.
What it can be.
Nothing moved here,
There's
right?
a best offer for the Heat, and that's the offer. You're correct, Kurt. Yeah.
Yeah. So I still think, look, everybody hit, this was like everybody kind of hitting the pause button, but I still feel like once you get closer to training camp and into the start of training camps, these talks will heat back up, and the Knicks, because of their boatload of picks, just kind of remain the favorite. It's at the end of the day, if you want picks, they're the team you're going to deal with.
Well, my thought is this, is I know a lot of people are saying the Heat can't outbid the Knicks, that they're just being used, that the Heat have already said they're content with their roster, and they probably will have to be. But I think this sort of sped up the process a little bit because of this reason. We know the Jazz are not playing to win this season. Kurt, you would agree with that after the Gobert trade.
I've got the opposite, yes.
And then they follow up with the Patrick Beverley trade, where they sent him out maybe for the potential of Taylor Horton-Tucker or not, but to get younger and play for the future there, taking a shot on basically the equivalent of a player the age of draft choices in THT. So I get that also. But how can you, as a respected organization, ask Donovan Mitchell to come into a place where he cannot win, where you are not playing for win, after the loyal service he has provided to this point? Don't they? I know there's no obligation. I know Donovan Mitchell is making so much money. You can't complain that much. But doesn't it just seem almost obligatory at this time, if not by the start of camp, certainly by the start of the regular season, that they need to resolve this out of fairness to everyone involved?
Yes. I mean, first off, yes, it seems that way. Yes, it feels like it should be that way. Whether Danny Ainge is going to see it that way might be a completely different question. I mean, that's the million-dollar question is he willing to ultimately just say that? Like, look, Will Hardy is a first-year coach in Utah, coming in
like
trying
35 years old, right? Very young.
Yeah, youngest coach in the league, going to try to come in and establish his culture, his personality, set up what he wants to do as an organization, because it's going to be a change from the way Quinn Snyder ran things. If he's got to sit down starting media day and then every day after until a trade happens and say, what about Donovan Mitchell? Where does this stand? Where is he in the rotation? Are you worried about playing his minutes too many? Do you have to show him off to get him traded? Do you playing him too much and risking injury? Like, every question in the world is going to come at him every day. It is going to be a disruption to have him there. And let alone, I think Donovan Mitchell has been a pro through this, hasn't said anything, has said, I was talked about, loving Utah. He did the first thing. He took Utah completely off his Twitter bio, which was the first hint that he's
that was
frustrated
crazy
with this.
yesterday. That was so obvious and so transparent and so almost snitty. And that's why, Kurt, I threw it back at you when I said, how much longer can you let this go on? Because the play that a player removing his team's name in his profile on Twitter got yesterday. Look, we all aggregate. We all look for the punchy little story. It came with a nice graphic, the before, the after. I get all of that. NBA Central, all these aggregation sites was all over it. But that's just one step. And as we've seen from the Kevin Durant playbook, there are 20 steps you can try to force your way out of it. I do want to reset right now because I sort of entered in the middle. So just to backtrack a little bit, the reason Kurt and I are talking about Donovan Mitchell at the top of this week's Inside the Paint, brought to you by RedRecover.com, is this. On Monday overnight and then Tuesday, report came out from Woj, then Shams, then everyone, that the Knicks had agreed to an extension with RJ Barrett. 4 years, $120 million. Kurt was immediately on text with me talking about how that related to Tyler Hero. We will get to that in a couple of minutes. What it mostly did was take RJ Barrett largely out of play in a trade, because once you get an extension from a rookie scale, you go out at a boatload of money, but you can only take back basically what the player is earning this season. The math simply doesn't work in those cases. Bobby Marks pointed this out. Of all the players who have gotten rookie scale extensions, there's been one player in NBA history who then was traded as he was awaiting his extension. Devin Harris, I believe it was.
Yeah,
it just doesn't happen. So the thought is, okay, the Knicks still will have all their chips. They have Obi Toppin, like you mentioned. They have Quentin Grimes. They have players they can make a deal work with. Cam Reddish, if anyone wants him. But they have the boatload of picks, and they have unprotected draft choices. Basically, what the Knicks try to do is force the Jazz's hands. Is saying, hey, we're not going to be like all these teams that were sitting around for Kevin Durant. We want to get on. A month from now, we will be not only in training camp, but just about ready to start the preseason. The overseas team starting the preseason. We want to get some continuity. They try to force Danny Ainge's hands. They failed. He said, yep, go ahead, sign him. We'll keep talking. Because like Kurt Helin said, what they want were first-round draft choices. What the Knicks have are first-round draft choices. What the Heat can't match are the amount of first-round draft choices or the quality of first-round draft choices. I'm going to give people sort of an abstract, and we'll get back to this. I would say if I'm Pat Riley, and I want you for a second, you can go ahead and be anyone you want to choose, Worldwide West or anyone at the Knicks over there, Leon Rose if you want. So if
I think Worldwide West has the best life, man. I'll take Wes's life.
Okay, I don't blame you at all. Then I believe you can't get photographed in public, but that's another story for another day. Okay, so I'm Pat Riley, Andy Ellisberg, Adam Simon, Nick Harrison, and Danny Ainge is making the phone call, and he's saying right now, August 31st, your best offer right now, Kurt, and then we can go ahead and do the sweeteners. And I'm the Heat, and I'm saying I'm probably offering Tyler Hero, Duncan Robinson to match the salaries, and one first-round draft choice. That's what I'm offering now. Right now, Kurt Helin, you're the Knicks. You know the situation right now that's going on with RJ Barrett. What's the Knicks' current, in your view, best offer?
That's a really good question. It's probably, like you said, the best offer they could put would be, and I've heard that they've stuck with the 2 unprotected first-round picks, 3 protected ones that they've gotten from other teams that have various levels of protection on them. Plus, like you said, Obi Toppin. If you're going to make it the best offer, it includes Quentin Grimes. They do not want to give Grimes up, so you can put some of the other young guys, like you said, Reddish.
And actually, I want to interrupt you for a second because I'm a naturally rude person. But Kurt, this is something I don't understand. If you've signed Jalen Brunson, I think it was about 4 years, 120, something like that, right? You gave him a boatload of money.
Actually.
Excuse me?
104.
104. Okay, I'm overstating because I love Jalen Brunson because I covered his dad. 104. And you're bringing in Donovan Mitchell, who's earning even more, okay? They're going to be your 2 starting guards. You'd agree with that, right?
Oh, yeah.
You can have 2 6'1" starting guards making that kind of money. This whole notion of the Heat protecting Quentin Grimes, I don't quite get. Because you're saying you're protecting a guy who you expect to give more minutes, but he's not a starter. That seems like an awfully weird line in the sand, doesn't it?
It does. I think it's keeping a future trade chip available because I think they realize if you're the Heat, you ultimately realize bringing in Donovan Mitchell, you get Donovan Mitchell for whatever the package ends up being. Like you said, Brunson, Donovan Mitchell, Julius Randle up front, where the rest of that roster
Mitchell
is
Robinson and a player to be named later, right?
Yeah, it's fine. It's good, by the way. It's probably can make the playoffs. 6, 5, 6, 7 seed, 8 seed, maybe. Like they're probably a play-in, but like they're not a bad team. And they're taking a step forward, and maybe they're a 6 seed. But either way, you're not a contender. You're not beating Miami. You're not beating. Even that team across the bay, you're not as good as Brooklyn. You're not across the bridge, let alone the Bucks or anybody else.
Celtics,
Boston.
Sixers.
So if you're not there, you've got future moves to make, and it might not be this season. But Grimes has value as a trade piece. He has looked good, so I think that's more the deal. And by the way, the RJ Barrett thing. Stephen Bondi finally at the Daily News had this the other day. $107 million guaranteed. $13 million, all sorts of incentives for him to make All-Star and All-NBA and yada, yada, yada.
Makes sense. So, again, and sort of maybe to add perspective in how we do our jobs, a lot of times we'll sit down starting in September and try to get our team previews and some work done ahead of time because we know when the news starts, there's going to be plenty of stuff out there to write off of. Kurt, if your assignment from NBC Sports right now at Basketball Talk was go ahead and write me your Heat season preview, would you feel comfortable that what you see is what you got? Or would you write Heat Preview A and Heat Preview B with Donovan Mitchell? In other words, I want the national perspective. I don't want to be Debbie Downer just here in Miami. Do you see any reasonable Heat pathway, knowing what the Knicks have to offer, just with the offer that you just gave me right here, that Donovan Mitchell comes to the Heat? Or are you pretty much writing your Heat season preview if Pro Basketball Talk says we need a proof draft by September 7th? Are you pretty much going with what the Heat have in place?
What they have in place. I've also heard that there just hasn't been a lot of talk. They're just the Heat and maybe this changes something. Maybe Danny Ainge picks up the phone, maybe Pat Riley or Andy picks up the phone and calls and starts a conversation. But as we said at the top, and you said, the offer is the offer at this point. Like what the Heat can offer is what the Heat can offer. And you could throw in a second pick and you could talk about protections on a third one or whatever, but ultimately that's putting in a lot for, again, we've discussed before, it becomes a question not just of, hey, we got Donovan Mitchell, but how much better is Donovan Mitchell than what you're expecting out of Tyler Hero? Like how big is that gap? How much do you want to give up to make up that gap? So where the Knicks, I think, are just the more desperate organization.
And also, and you mentioned they want unprotected picks. And I've spoken to Big O about this in our Accurate Pembroke Pines reports on Monday and Fridays. We'll do Thursday this week. And an unprotected New York Knicks pick can be a golden ticket, correct? It could be sort of like that first-round pick that Detroit threw away years ago for Otis Thorpe that turned out to be, in one of the greatest drafts ever, and they were sort of shut out there. So I get all that. A Knicks unprotected pick, I think the years, I might be wrong, are 27 and 29, but let's go in that rough time frame. There's a chance that could be a first pick in the draft or a top 3, top 5 pick. You'd agree, correct?
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the advantages they have, and we've spoken about this.
Knicks and they suck,
right? Yeah, the Heat aren't going to be bad.
Yes,
the Heat as an organization are just not going to be terrible. The Knicks certainly have the opportunity to, and by the way, that's why the Jazz ultimately want to bring the Lakers into this and get their 27, 29, and that those can move a little bit, unprotected picks, because when LeBron leaves and that thing could implode, and those could be incredibly valuable picks.
I agree. Matter of fact, there's another element of this, but it's such an in-depth discussion, and Kurt actually texted me. We went back and forth on this. Now that we know the figures, like Kurt just reported on the RJ Barrett extension, well, Tyler Hero is also extension eligible. And that also impacts whether the Heat can make a trade or not, or whether he becomes a poison pill player. So in our second segment, if you can't catch it now, it'll be on the podcast of our RedRecover.com Inside the Paint show. I want to talk about comparative value, Tyler Hero versus RJ Barrett. But I don't want to leave the chat board too far behind, because once I get behind, I get in trouble. So I want to go to the chat board real quick here. Too Extreme ask. He asked Ira, but I'm sure he'd ask Kurt if he knew him on a first-name basis also. Do you think the Heat make a trade for Miles Turner, or did they feel good with the current roster and hope to make a push for 3 or 4? Miles Turner is a very interesting name. because it's gotten a lot of traction lately around the league, and it's gotten a lot of traction at Kurt's home out there in LA because of the Lakers' impact. So I'm going to go sort of real quick here on Miles Turner and a couple of things. Number one, Kurt, do you believe Miles Turner, who's approaching a contract year, this is his last year on a contract, does he get traded? I'll give you the long view. Does he get traded this season from the Indiana Pacers?
Absolutely. He will. They're in the Wembanyama sweepstakes. They are not going to be good this year. And by the way, of all the guys, with all due respect to Buddy Hield, that's a guy who can come in and make a difference. I'm kind of a big Turner guy. I think he is underrated a little bit. Both, look, block shots, he hits threes. He is a pretty darn good modern big who could help a lot of teams.
And the trade that I've heard out there, and obviously I know you've been tracking this also, has been something along the line of Miles Turner and Buddy Hield to the Lakers for the Lakers to allowable, unprotected, I think 27-29 or is it 26-28, Kurt?
They can't. It depends on pick swaps and other stuff. But
okay, so let's say in the 27-29 range, unprotected, and Russell Westbrook's contract because he's the ultimate cap filler these days. I sort of don't get this from the Indiana standpoint for this reason. Indiana has been talking for years how they've been stuck in place, how the Turner, Sabonis sort of reality there never produced anything. They want to move on. Are we in a place right now, Kurt, where teams are willing to look 7 years down the road? In other words, you're telling fans in Indiana, Miles Turner is still a pretty good player. You'd agree with that, correct?
Oh,
pretty good player.
Absolutely.
Buddy Hield's a pretty good shooter. I mean, he has a certain value. You'd agree with that, correct?
Absolutely. It's the most valuable skill in the league. So,
okay, so fine. So you have all of this going on right now where you have two players who can contribute. Is this where the NBA is right now, that you're willing to give up in the moment for, if we're talking 27 and 29, 5 and 7 years down the road? Isn't that a big FU middle finger to your fans?
A little bit, especially for an Indiana team that's never done that, right? Like, they have never been a team that tanked. Like, they've always, and that's part, but maybe part of the issue is that at some point in today's NBA, it's really hard, and Miami's been better at this than most. It's hard to rebuild on the fly and remain relevant. Like, that is much trickier. It is much easier to bottom out even for a couple years, get a couple draft picks, and kind of then start to return. They've never done that. I think that's part of the reason they, for a long time, at least since the Reggie Miller, they've been good but not a real threat, not a contender.
Yeah,
it looks like for the first time in a long time, Ira, they might be willing to be really bad for a couple of years.
I'm not talking a couple of years. We're talking a 2029 first round pick. You're talking 7 years. Got a couple I want to hit real quick before the break. Jose Villarreal asks us, is it worth the Knicks giving up their future draft and cap space just to be a number 4 through number 7 seed? This has been addressed a lot, Kurt. Real quickly, isn't this more about if the Knicks go ahead and make a Mitchell trade, it's part one of probably a 2-part process of trying to do something else immediately as well?
I think it is part of a 2-part process. I'm not sure how immediate that's going to be, because I think their next move is to make another big swing for the fences and bring in another star. Who knows who that's going to be and when they're going to be available. The NBA is unpredictable on that front, but yes, it is move one of multiple moves.
Okay, and just real quick, one of our listeners in here said they forgot the show starts early. Again, on Wednesdays, I'm going to start traveling. Kurt's got to get up and go to work also. Our typical time for the redrecover.com Inside the Paint show will be 9 a.m. on Wednesdays. Might have to move around if I'm on the plane. Apparently, Kurt, they don't like us FaceTiming on the plane for an hour. So when the guy's yelling the row behind me, shut the F up, I can understand. But this will be our typical time. But after our break, I want to come back. Did R.J. Barrett at 4 years, $20 million with his incentives included set the bar for Tyler Hero? Is Tyler Hero worth the same outlay to the Heat as R.J. Barrett is to the Knicks? We'll be back with that after this break on redrecover.com Inside the Paint. Weekly hour-long show here on the Big O Show. So sort of take people behind the scenes. We really are just sort of a bunch of sports junkies when something comes out. So I don't even know if it's related to our show, but Kurt texted me yesterday and he says, you know what? With this R.J. Barrett extension, is this going to be the framework for Tyler Hero? and we went back and forth a little. So I'll sort of give you my perspective, get Kurt's perspective, and then certainly you can join us right here on our chat board. Isaiah's already chimed in on the chat board. We'll get to that in a second. So RJ Barrett, Kurt, you explained this in our previous segment. Folks, you can catch it on our podcast. He signed what was listed as a 4-year, $120 million extension that doesn't kick in this season. It starts the season after this, 23-24. Kurt noted that Phil Bondi from the New York Daily News, Stephen Bondi, I keep thinking of his dad. Stephen Bondi from the Daily News reported about 103 guaranteed, the rest in incentives. Is that correct, Kurt?
107 guaranteed.
107. Okay, so 13 million in incentives. So Kurt was asking whether it's the same, and then I did some research. I actually mentioned this in my Ask Ira today when I was going through Tyler possibilities. To me, this is apples and oranges for this reason, and then Kurt has a different thought. The last 2 seasons, RJ Barrett has been a starter who has started at least 70 games in each of those seasons. Tyler Hero, through his 3 years right now, has started 35 total games, has never started more than 15 games in his career. So on one hand, you're saying a proven NBA starter is getting up to $120 million over 4 years. Should Tyler Hero, who is the defending Sixth Man of the Year award winner in the NBA, be viewed in the same prism? I don't think so. I think he has been sort of a complimentary player, never asked to handle the same type of load as RJ Barrett. Now, that doesn't mean NBA economics don't get in the way. But Kurt, your thought was that Tyler is in the same economic class as RJ Barrett. And why don't you give people your reasoning on that?
Or at least close. And it's not
Okay.
just that they both score 20 plus points a game, right? Like, in fact, it's more that Tyler didn't start in Miami and RJ did, partially because of the organizations and the system. It was a good team in Miami. Tyler had to find a role on a good team. In New York, they're like, RJ, would you like the ball? Like, here you go, man. Go create, go do stuff. Because you had the really good season from Julius Randle, the rookie year, but they've let him, for better or worse, they've let him kind of be himself and find his footing. And I think RJ Barrett's, by the way, everything I've heard is a very hardworking and like kind of a high IQ player. I think ultimately he's going to figure it out. Right now, his game is he is very good in isolation. He can create for himself. He's not as efficient a scorer as you would hope. And more importantly, I think for the Knicks long term, he needs to be a little more of a playmaker, right? Like, it's not just about you. He's got to move the ball. That's all that said. You're betting on who this guy is going to be. I don't know that, to me, Hero's at least sort of close in the ballpark. Like, that's a range where I could see him maybe a little hot, maybe a little less, but I think the starting thing may just be situational.
Okay, Kurt, you're the general manager of the NBA's new 31st franchise. You can choose between these two players, and it's kind of a similar decision because they're the same draft class and roughly the same age. Tyler a little younger, but you had to choose one of them. So honestly here, because this will settle it, congratulations on landing a new franchise. You'll tell us another time whether you're putting it in Vegas or Seattle. Which player would you take if you had a choice between the two?
First off, there's no question that I would rather choose Seattle over Vegas, but
I'm with you.
But I'd take RJ. As much as I just said, like last segment, shooting's the biggest skill in the league. It's second actually to shot creation. The ability to create a look is still the single hardest, most valuable thing in the NBA because there's not that many guys of the 450 guys in the league. How many guys can really do that? It's 50, 60. Like, it's a hard skill to come by. So I'd probably take RJ. Yeah.
And also it has relative value to the rosters. And the Knicks, matter of fact, I'm glad I can defer to you on some of this. Who is the Knicks? This is kind of convoluted, so I'm going to ask it both ways. Best/most important player on their roster right now. The moves they made this summer, copacetic where they are now. Who is the best/most important, which I know often are two different things, but let's put it in one category. Which player is that?
It's hard to say without having seen it because without having seen the RJ Barrett and Jalen Brunson dynamic, I'm going to say Barrett because he's a little younger and he's more key to whatever they're going to become. Brunson is kind of Brunson's Brunson at this point, right? Like, we know what he is, we know what he's going to be, and it's a very good player.
Right.
I think if the Knicks want to be, and there might be a few Knicks fans in Miami. There might be a few who move down there. Those people will be rooting. If you're rooting long term for the Knicks and you're rooting for Brunson, for Brunson. Well, you're rooting for Brunson, but you're rooting for Barrett to evolve to the next level.
Number 3
over
pick
the
in the
next
draft should amount to something. We know down here with Michael Beasley, number 2, when you lose a draft choice that early as someone who doesn't amount to something, it sets you back. It changes your course. So I totally get that. My point being here is, then if you do the question with Tyler Hero with the Heat, where does he stand on the Heat hierarchy? We'll do this together. I'll bring you into my world down here. I would say number 1, Bam Adebayo, because of his mixture of youth and versatility on both ends of the court, that he's going to be a long-term player, that basically they've sort of rebuffed every Bam Adebayo overture, including with Kevin Durant, it seems. So I would say he's maybe number 1 on my list. Could you find a way to agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I would.
Okay. I would say
it's because of the youth, yes.
And based on what he's done, I would say Jimmy Butler, who, whether it's getting to the bubble finals with every last breath, or within getting the Heat within almost on his own when others were injured last year, getting the Heat within 1 game of the NBA Finals, I would say Jimmy Butler is number 2. Could you buy that? Could you go there with me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I would then say, even though he was uneven last year, the fact that they spent 3 years, $85 million on Kyle Lowry, you would, I think, agree there's a huge expectation level on Kyle Lowry for these next 2 seasons. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I'm curious to hear from you at some point, like, what kind of shape he's in this year. Is he really ready for it?
Well, and we've seen the pictures, but I think pictures lie in the offseason because everyone's having their own social media director taking their picture. The point I'm making with Tyler there is right now Tyler Hero stands as the 4th most important element at the moment for the Heat. You may move him up to number 2 when it comes to bridge to the future, but clearly behind Bam Adebayo. And a matter of fact, this year, there was a chance, and this is not to denigrate Tyler and what he's doing, there was a chance that Victor Oladipo could be more productive for the Heat than Tyler Hero. At least a chance. It might be 10%, it might be 15%, it might be 20%, but I'm saying there's at least a chance based on the body of work of Victor Oladipo and how he's driven to sort of set everyone straight on what's going on, that he could sort of be up there also. So I think Tyler's on a different level. All of that said, I'm coming at a roundabout point here. One of our listeners, Isaiah, chimed in with Tyler is better than RJ. I really feel that Tyler can be a Robin to a Batman, and I agree with all that. Would you give Tyler Hero 4 years at $20 million or even 4 years at $107 with incentives? In other words, you were texting me yesterday saying you thought that's the roadmap for Tyler's extension. So if you're Pat Riley, Andy Ellisberg, Adam Simon, anyone else who signs checks over there at the Heat, is that what we're looking at? Is that what I should expect as a Heat beat writer at the Sun Sentinel to see Tyler, if he gets the extension, agreeing to that?
First off, he's going to ask for that. Let's not think of it. He's going to ask for that. And if I were them, I would aim a little lower. Like you said, I think it comes back to the money you're already paying out for. Bam's got the max, and you're obviously paying Butler and everything else. But also, like you said, just the place of importance on the roster. I'd probably aim for something closer to 4 years, 100, that starts a little lower. Because he's worth more than the average starter, $18 million.
Well,
so
that's interesting. You bring out that number, Kurt, because of another number you just gave me. So you're putting Tyler Hero's equivalency with Jalen Brunson.
Probably close to that, a little bit less than that. I mean, I think part of this is you're betting on your bridge to the future. I mean, you are betting on this contract going 4 or 5 years out, and Tyler Hero is part of whatever is next. I mean, if you're not trading him, he is part of whatever is and extending him. He's part of, with Bam, whatever you envision this team being 3 years down the line, 5 years down the line when Jimmy Butler.
The money is one element with Tyler. Let's go to element number 2. Once Tyler becomes extended, and the difference with him with the poison pill is more extreme than RJ Barrett, because Tyler was a 13 pick and RJ Barrett was a number 3 pick. So RJ Barrett's current salary is much higher than Tyler's anyway, but I'm going to leave that aside. Basically, once Tyler is assigned to an extension, he is trade ineligible until next July. Let's talk about timing elements, Kurt. Let's talk about being taken care of. You and I, Big O, we've all been at some point in our life at a point where we want to get our money now. We want to settle on a deal. We want to know what we're going to get paid. We want to move because we believe we're worth it. Should the Heat wait on Tyler Hero until I believe the date is October 16th, the latest they can do this extension? Should they make Tyler happy and whole right now? Or does it behoove this, as I've written at the Sun Sentinel, behoove the Heat to give themselves as much time to see if there are trades out there? So the timing element on Tyler Hero's extension, are the Heat doing Tyler dirty by waiting? Hell, the Knicks did it before the end of August for RJ Barrett. The Spurs, a $20 million a year, did it for Keldon Johnson back. They did it back in July. Give me the balance here on the timing element with Tyler. And again, because every Wednesday, redrecover.com, Inside the Paint, you do play the role of a general manager. How would you handle that?
Part of it depends on Tyler's personality and how he's going to take this, because there's a part of me, if I'm in the front office of the Heat, that would I be willing to not extend him? Would I be willing to go into the season and that makes him a restricted free agent next summer? And you can match any offer, but those offers, if he has a really good season, could be much higher. You could pay more.
Sure.
I would wait though. I'm with you. There is no reason to do this right now. I get why the Knicks did it. It was part of the threat trying to get the Donovan Mitchell thing dealt with. And they wanted Barrett as part of the future anyway. If I'm the Heat, I'm holding off until the final minute to do this. If I do it at all, again, I might be willing. If I don't think it's going to adversely affect the relationship or adversely affect Tyler and the production, and I might drag this out till next summer.
Okay, and the Suns did the exact same thing with DeAndre Ayton last offseason. They waited. Yeah. They got the offer sheet from Indiana. They matched the offer sheet and all that, and it got taken care of. That did seem to fray things. I know right now DeAndre is saying, no, copacetic, going to camp. I love my teammates. Didn't say anything about James Jones or Robert Sarver, but he said, I'm ready to go in. Had some uneven minutes moments with Monty Williams during the playoffs. If you're the Heat and you look at how it played out right now with the Suns, would you risk that with Tyler Hero? Or do you say, hey, it's the NBA, it's a business?
There's a certain level of the NBA, it's a business. Again, I think it just comes back to the relationship you have with Tyler Hero and everybody knew DeAndre Ayton wanted to get paid, right? And wanted to get paid the max. He was a number one pick who expected to make that money. And that it would fray the relationship. I don't know, and you might know better. How is that going to affect Tyler? Is that going to? Will he take that personally and carry that grudge over? And by the way, those grudges don't show up immediately. Everybody says everybody sings "Kumbaya" the first year.
Right.
Wait about 2 years. Let's see where that.
2 years, but in 2 years he'll have his money either from the Heat or an offer sheet. So he'll have his money eventually. So I do think he'll be able to get over that. I think you move past that. I think. Again, it's an interesting dynamic. It's a matter of the money. It's a matter of the tradability and what you can do there. So I get all of that. I want to get back here to the chat board real quick because it's interesting. One of our listeners, Willie Molina, asked Big O actually if he knew if Jimmy Butler was in Medellin this summer. Yes, he was for his coffee company, Big Face Coffee. He went down there. He sampled the beans. So he took care of that. And really an issue for me all summer has been, it's almost like I know this goes way back. Do you remember Where's Waldo, the kids series, and you have to find him, like in the pictures, and then Where in the World is Carmen Santiago? That's Jimmy Butler. He has been everywhere this summer. My wife will ask me, where's Jimmy? Well, he's either in the Hamptons, or he's either in Europe, or he's either in South America. He's in Miami for a day, and then he's gone to a tennis match. He's been in Cincinnati watching tennis. He's very close with some of the players. So Jimmy has done his entire world tour. I expect him to be back for the start of training camp. With Jimmy, you never know specifically. So, yes. So, for those asking where Jimmy was, if you were in Colombia this summer, you did see Jimmy Butler there. He's been using his contract with that private plane and flying everywhere. So, it's been an interesting offseason for Jimmy. He sees the world. He is a world traveler. there's a good chance if you're at an airport, you have seen Jimmy Butler this summer. Kurt, after this break, our final time out here on Inside the Paint, brought to you by RedRecover.com. I want to go over the Heat's free agency. The Heat had 6 free agents this summer. They've all now settled in place with the report now that Marquis Morris is going to take, which I'm surprised, a non-guaranteed one-year deal with the Brooklyn Nets. So basically, the Heat had 6 free agents this summer. We know about PJ Tucker and Marquis Morris left. They kept Dedmon. They kept Oladipo. They kept Caleb Martin. So they've kept a certain amount of guys also they had to take care of. Udonis Haslem being the 6th player. I want to do a little bit of a scorecard. If you thought it played out the way the Heat thought it should, the way it played out, whether the contracts were fair, because finally, on the final day here of August, we have closure of every Heat player who was a free agent this offseason. So we'll discuss that when we come back after this break on RedRecover.com, Inside the Paint. And we're back on Inside the Paint, brought to you by RedRecover.com. If you missed either of our first 2 segments, in our opening segment, we spoke about R.J. Barrett getting his contract extension, how that might impact the Donovan Mitchell trade talks, and whether the Heat are in or out there. You can catch that in any of the podcast outlets for the Big O radio program. In our second segment, we spoke about whether Tyler Hero deserves a similar extension to that of R.J. Barrett. And I want to go now to our third segment here on Inside the Paint, brought to you by RedRecover.com, and talk about Heat free agency and sort of sum it up now that all 6 of their free agents are taken care of. First, I want to go to the chat board. Dougie Fresh asks, why does Kurt look like he's at a public library and Ira look like he's at a sports bar under construction? My answer is this. I am still waiting for my liquor license. So once we get the liquor license, you'll see the beer taps behind me will be taken care of. And as anyone knows, Kurt is incredibly studious from that the California State collegiate program out there. Was it Cal Northridge? Am I right, Kurt?
Yes.
Right. So, again, I'm Binghamton, public education. I'm all for that. But it shows that Kurt is saying studious, which leads us perfectly to our next segment.
And you know what it shows, Hira? It shows my wife is an English teacher, is what it shows.
Fair enough right there. So at least someone in the house is reading books, because it's interesting. Usually when you look at these libraries, it's just all sports books or books that have been written by the guys who are actually talking. So that's good to know. Kurt, the Heat is done with free agency. They had 6 free agents going into the offseason. Everyone's now accounted for. I'm going to go backwards here a little bit. Marquis Morris yesterday widely reported agreed to a 1-year, apparently non-guaranteed, which surprised me, contract. This will be Marquis Morris's 6th team in the last 5 years. As you know, he did stop off in LA to win a championship with the Lakers, so he's had some success along the way. Is Marquis Morris still a thing in 2022 in the NBA?
He can be a solid 15-minute-a-night backup rotation player, right? Like, I think he can give you some solid minutes. I think he gives you what's important is, and I think what mattered in Los Angeles absolutely will matter in Brooklyn is he's also a strong personality. He is somebody who's going to come out and say, hey, we're not doing this right, or call somebody out in a film session or whatever needs to be done. He has the gravitas to do that, to stand up in a locker room with LeBron James and Anthony Davis and do that. He can certainly do that. I think the Nets need those kind of personalities in that locker room, because I'm not sure their coach is that guy, but that's a whole different conversation. So I get that. I think he has some value, but it's limited. Like, he's not going to play, right? It's going to be a limited value.
All right, I'm going to look up gravitas and then be right back on the show here. Clearly the husband of an English teacher. Do the Heat lose something by losing Marquis Morris? We know the reason why. The Heat are actually less than $200,000 below the luxury tax. You probably don't go into the luxury tax to bring back a Marquis Morris, so I understand that. But we also know the Heat basically have a lot of questions at power forward. You probably could have made an argument that Marquis Morris could have competed for the starting power forward role with the Heat right now. To any degree, is that one that got away from the Heat?
Let me put it this way. I think that losing, and you kind of touched on this, the combination of losing PJ Tucker and Marquis Morris hurts your depth at the 4, right? Like, now you don't have a veteran presence at the 4 that you can lean on, especially lean on in the postseason. So I think individually you can say, oh, I get, PJ Tucker wanted to leave and we didn't need to want to go into the tax to bring back Morris, and it all makes sense. But eventually, either somebody's got to step up at the 4 and fill that role, or you're going to have to go get somebody to fill that role, because ultimately you're going to need more out of that position.
And I agree. Let's go to the Nets standpoint on that, because I find Marquis interesting from this standpoint. The Nets, just before, on the eve of last year's playoffs, they settled their playoff roster, let another former Heat power forward, James Johnson, walk away. So James Johnson held that role. At times last year, Blake Griffin held that role, had his moments. At times last season, LaMarcus Aldridge held that role, had his moments. Basically, all three of those guys aged out. And it's not like Marquis is a spring chicken. So my question is, the Nets taking on Marquis Morris, do you think that's more an act of desperation by the Nets, that there's just not enough left, and now that Durant's coming back, we've got to settle our roster? Or do you think the Nets really look at Marquis Morris as he can be a contributor? And I only ask that for this reason. If you think he can be a contributor, you probably guarantee that contract. You don't come in with such a low ball offer. So from James Johnson and Blake Griffin and LaMarcus Aldridge, is that an upgrade, or is that another older guy sideway move?
Yeah, it's a lateral move to me. I think it just tries to fill that role. And it's funny, when I wrote the little note that at NBC Sports, like, hey, they signed him. I wanted to write, he'll be backing up. And look, I don't know who's playing what position, exactly what that rotation is. Ben Simmons your 4, but a kind of a point 4?
I think
Kevin
he is
Durant your 4? Like, I don't know what their rotation is.
And Kyrie in there, yeah.
Yeah.
Again, Ben Simmons, what is a Ben Simmons?
Yeah. So he will get some minutes. I don't think he'll start. I think it'll come off the bench there, but I have no idea. It's tough to say because I just have no idea what their rotations look like. Frankly, I don't know that Steve Nash does until he gets everybody in camp and running around and playing a couple of games, does he?
As in future former Nets coach Steve Nash, but we'll leave that for another day. Okay. Fair enough there. I just posted a story at sunsentinel.com. It'll be in your newspaper in your driveway tomorrow morning, summing up the Heat's 6 free agents and what happened. Basically, Kurt, the way it came down, at least in my view, is once they did the deals with Dwayne Dedmon, Victor Oladipo, and Caleb Martin, and then Udonis Haslem came back, they were out of money. They couldn't, whether it was Marquis or anyone else. So here's the question I had, because I was trying to figure this out. Basically, to me, the choice came down not between Udonis or Marquis, because Udonis Haslem is in his own category. He's in his comeback for a 20th season. You do what you want. We're not going to be the ones who are ending your career. You're going to be the one who makes that decision. Yeah. So to me, it came down to Dwayne Dedmon. And the fact that they gave Dwayne Dedmon a 2-year, $8 million year, the second year not guaranteed, but the first year a doubling of his minimum scale salary from last season, I sort of sat there and said, wait a minute. They have Bam Adebayo at center. They have this very intriguing prospect in Omar Yurtseven as their backup center, who maybe you give minutes to. None of those guys are really power forwards. You're not casting Dedmon ever at power forward. You're not casting Yurtseven, I don't think, at power forward. I don't think he has the lateral movement. So my question to you would be, from an outside perspective, Dwayne Dedmon or Marquis Morris, where would the better value have been? And are you surprised the way they went so quickly all in on a Dwayne Dedmon?
I like Dedmon's versatility, I guess, a little bit, though. I think, I don't know. He's younger. He's a little more athletic than where Marquis is at this point in his career. So I was a little surprised they went quick, but I actually don't think, yes, it's more than what he was making, but I don't think what they're paying him is some, it's not some massive number, right? Like it's a reasonable number. And I think they're comfortable with him as part of that rotation up front, whatever that rotation ends up looking like. Is Bam your 4? I don't think you can play him. I don't think you want to play him next to one of those guys.
No, I mean, that's the thing. I haven't asked our question I'm going to address today about one of my readers said, why don't they just try it? And I'm like, Eric Spoelstra in the last 4 years has done everything he can not to play two bigs together. I mean, there are years where the minutes of Adebayo and Dedmon together in the regular season are like 4 minutes. And Yurtseven and Bam last year were like 30 minutes. There was one game in Brooklyn when PJ Tucker sat out, and they tried to experiment with that. But if you go back even to the Hassan Whiteside era, he never played Whiteside and Bam Adebayo together. His belief is, and as most coaches I think believe, the NBA is in a downsized era. Matter of fact, I'm going to do one of those radio things that I hate as a guest, when I put someone on the spot, make them think in their head about all 30 teams. But I'm going to do it right now to our good friend Kurt Helin out in LA at 6 God knows something in the morning. Kurt, are there any teams in the NBA right now? And I know this is a horrible thing to do. I hate when people do it to me. Can you even think of big anywhere in the NBA that teams either played it last year or are considering playing it? It just doesn't seem like we have that much left in today's NBA.
Minnesota. They are going to do it with Towns and Gobert this year, and that's going to be an interesting experiment. There's a few teams. Part of what becomes the problem is we talk about big, but it's really small ball's more about skill. I mean, Kevin Durant's 7 feet tall. We don't think of him, right? Like in those terms. It's more about skill sets, and that's why Minnesota's interesting in that, yeah, Towns can space the floor a little, and Gobert's the better defender, but that is kind of a true Twin Towers big matchup in a way that's not there for some of the other, the Bulls run, Carter and Markkanen, and they run this big, and Vucevic, they run this big front line, but Markkanen's not a center. Like he's
actually no, Markkanen now is in Cleveland, right?
Oh, in Cleveland, right?
But that's actually a perfect example because with Mobley, Markkanen, and the way they're running through their centers there, they do start the game.
I'm in Cleveland, yeah.
Right, they do. Cleveland does start their game with 3 bigs. They start with 3 7-footers, so I get that also. There are certain teams that play in that direction. But again, those are the exceptions, number one. Number two, we don't know if we're going to see that in the playoffs. It seems like bigs get played off the floor in the playoffs unless they can come out and switch the pick and roll when every single possession matters. The other one I'd put in there, but he's sort of a hybrid, is what the Celtics are doing with Robert Williams and Al Horford. They went big against the Heat. They hurt the Heat to a degree. We know Horford can hit the three-pointer. We know Williams is incredibly athletic and can switch out there and is a very versatile defensive player also. So they're unique. But again, those are the exceptions. So when you say, hey, let's go into an 82-game season and play Adebayo and Yurtseven or Adebayo and Dedmon, you just don't have that many chances. It's too sort of out of the box of where the NBA is right now. So that's where the Dwayne Dedmon re-signing sort of caught me a little bit off guard. Then we go when we talk about the Heat. So there's 4 other players the Heat re-signed or let go in free agency. The PJ Tucker thing, is there any point now that we're basically 2 months after the fact that PJ Tucker left basically for equivalent money because there's no state income tax in Florida from the $32 million offer he had 3 years from the Sixers to the $28 million 3-year, both fully guaranteed, kind of shocking for a 37-year-old guy from the Heat. When you look back at the Heat, the way they played it, when you look back at Tucker, the way he played it, do you think there's any remorse, or do you think maybe, even though people around the league are saying, oh, the Heat sort of are dynamic, drastically different, what's your thought on 2 months after the fact, the PJ Tucker disappearance?
I just couldn't have given 3 years to Tucker. I don't fault the Heat there because he is 37, and maybe for Philly, who's as win now a team is, and not, I guess Miami kind of is, but like, Philly desperately needs to win now, so maybe we'll pay this now and pay the price for it on the back end. PJ Tucker's game obviously ages very well, and you can limit his minutes in the season. But if I'm the Heat, there's other trades, there's other things. You can look down the line at this. I just could not lock myself in. As much as I like PJ Tucker, the player, and I think he's good in the locker room, you can count him in the playoffs and everything else. I can't lock him in for 3 years. I just can't.
And the interesting part, and I mentioned this in the story you just posted at sunsentinel.com, the Heat initially were not going to give 3 years. And they had to go to Mickey Arison and get approval. And there was some real consternation there about how much he had left in his tank for the 3rd year. But then they realized Daryl Morey and James Harden had their wink. We'll see if there's tampering down the road, that Harden would take just enough less so that the Sixers could fit in below their luxury tax line because they wanted to give him the non-taxpayer full 10.5 mid-level exception. So the Heat were willing to go to the 3 years. I think in the long run, not this season, but a year or two down the road, I think the Heat might come out ahead when we see what's left of PJ Tucker. And honestly, if I'm the Sixers with their young players, I would want someone to challenge PJ Tucker a year now down the road, 2 years down the road for that starting job to know that I'm growing as a team. Okay, so Marquis Morris left, PJ Tucker left. The players who came back, we talked about Dwayne Dedmon. We debated his value there. The Udonis thing, I think you would agree, Kurt. If you're talking about ability, and again, congratulations on being a general manager, and you're weighing players, you might say, hey, he's not one of our 15 best, 18 best, 20 best. But you got to agree, the Heat's back were against a wall. That was all up
No.
to Udonis when it came to the magic number of a 20th season. You'd agree the ball was literally in his court.
Yeah, absolutely. He is. Look, there's not another comparable person to him. Like we tried about a week ago. There's just nobody
and
like
came
him
up with
around the
Jared
league.
Dudley, who's now an assistant coach, right?
Right.
Yeah,
So,
and Nick Collison's out of the league. We don't have another player like that.
Yeah.
Victor Oladipo originally took a one-year deal at $11 million, and the Heat said, wait a minute, we want to stay below the luxury tax. They changed it into a 2-year deal worth about 16. There's a player option on the second year. It makes Victor Oladipo tradable as of January 15th. Everyone gets more flexibility. For Vic, if something happens with the knee again, he gets more money over 2 years. If he has a good year, he's out after a year anyway with his player option. I think that's a pretty reasonable deal for both involved. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think so. And by the way, I think that's one of the best bets of the summer, right?
Yeah, I agree.
What
The
he can
money
do, but
is there for someone who could be very special, especially if you wind up making a Tyler Hero trade for another position when they were in the Durant talks. You have that backup there. So I agree with that. Caleb Martin, 3 years, $20 million. In today's NBA, isn't that also for a potential starter a bargain deal?
Very much so. And by the way, what we haven't discussed is with some of this stuff, and it applies to the RJ Barrett, Tyler Hero discussion from the last segment on the Inside the Paint with Red Recover. The cap's going up. The cap is going up 10% next year, probably. It's going to go up considerably when the new TV deal comes in. If you're going, especially multiple years out, 3, 4, 5 years out with some of these deals, what looks like you're kind of like, wow, you're going to pay RJ Barrett $120 million now, and think about it. It's not going to be bad against the cap in a few years, and that's part of it. That Caleb Martin deal looks good now and will look, I think, very good in a few years.
Yes, it's just crazy that today's $30 million average, like you're talking about RJ Barrett, if he makes his incentives, is really going to be tomorrow's, I don't know, $15 million, because I think over the term of that deal, remember, that extension doesn't kick in until after this year. With the new television rights, with the new streaming rights, I think everything changes right there. So that wraps up the 6 Heat free agents, at least now August 31st. Everyone who started the season's off season's a free agent for the Heat is accounted for, and you can move forward. Do want to jump to the chat board real quick before we're done here on our redrecover.com Inside the Paint. Jose asked, he thinks John Collins might be more movable with the Hawks losing all those picks to San Antonio in the DeJounte Murray trade, and that there might be a deal for him. Kurt, I haven't heard a lot about John Collins. It seems to me now that the Hawks are willing to sort of what they have in place, see what could work, and then go from there. It's almost like I heard more John Collins trade talk before this offseason than I'm hearing now. Your thoughts on John Collins and whether he's on the trade market or whether we're just putting him on the trade market here every week?
No, I think he's absolutely available, but I think he's a vintage case of what the Hawks believe he's worth and what the other 29 teams believe he's worth is very different right now. And there are days he looks like he's worth every penny that the Hawks could potentially pay him. But there's just not, let's put it this way. There's a lot of teams just not high on what his ceiling is and the ceiling at the salary he's at. There are teams, he's a good player. He is a bouncy player. I don't want to say he's bad. He's a good player, but there's a lot of people who just aren't convinced he's worth the money he's getting paid. I
know you at Basketball Talk and me at the Sunset, and we don't get into gossip. There's been talk over the years that he doesn't enjoy playing with Trae Young, who really is so ball dominant, and so usage dominant. Do you buy anything into that, or do you think that's just because when you play with the ball dominant player, whether it's an Iverson or a Trae Young or a player like that, you just have to make that adjustment?
A lot of that came up when he was up for a contract, which I think is part of it.
Money.
He wanted to put up some numbers one year, and Trae is ball dominant, although I think he's become a better playmaker and passer and setting guys up than he was a few years ago. And it's going to be interesting with DeJounte Murray now how that plays out, because DeJounte's really good at moving the ball around and keeping guys happy.
So that could actually help John Collins. Last question on the way out. Do you see Duncan Robinson traded before the season starts? I'm going to answer that first. And my thing is, he's the ultimate cap filler. If Duncan Robinson is traded, it's because the Heat are making the big one. But unless there's a big deal, you save that $16 to $18 million salary, because the NBA is also about salary cap ballast, which is why a player, even like a Russell Westbrook, has certain value right now to fill in trades. Kurt, do you think Duncan Robinson's on the Heat opening night roster? What do you think his prospects for riding out the season with the Heat is? are.
I think you hit the nail on the head. Yes, I think he's there at the start of the season, but the most valuable contracts in a trade right now are, just like you said, somewhere between about 12 million and 20 million. Those team contracts, because you can do them individually, you can combine them in certain combos. The smartest front offices have multiple of those. Go look at to use an easy one out here. Go look at the Clipper rotation,
sure,
or the roster. Plenty of movable, tradable pieces if they want to. They've got a couple of big stars, but a lot of guys on very movable contracts. Duncan is that, and you don't give, like you said, you don't give him up unless that's a big swing for the fans.
Yeah, I almost think this season Duncan should wear a salary number on his jersey because that might come down to his value more than his actual jersey number. But that's for another day. We've made it through an NBA August with hour-long shows every Wednesday. Congratulations, Kurt. And we'll be back next Wednesday on redrecover.com Inside the Paint. But for now, the Big O Show rolls on.
You've been listening.
This is the Big O Show. This is the Big O Show.